You know, there are lots of big names in sports, and ice skating is no exception. But if there's one person that deserves more credit than others, it's Norval Baptie, a legend among legends. Baptie was born into a Scottish-Canadian family in 1879. Theirs was a small village with no more than 300 people living there. Norval's mother, being of the Scottish origin, gave him a name in the Gaelic language, which meant from a village in the north. When he was only 1 year old, the family moved to North Dakota and spent the rest of their lives in the USA. Already at a young age, Norval was showing great talent at skating. When he was 10, he won his first race. At the age of 14, he became the champion of North Dakota, and several years later, he easily beat the current world racing champion, Jack McCullough. And that was only the beginning of his brilliant career in the world of ice skating. Baptie was just short of obsessed with this sport and took part in every competition he could. In 1902, in a 5-mile race in Saranac Lake, New York, he set the world speed record for the distance that wasn't beaten for several decades. As a speed skater, he raced and won in almost 5,000 competitions and retired in 1918 as a champion that had never been bested. It's said that Baptie only lost once in his entire career, but no hard records exist of that defeat, and 2 years after he officially retired, he confirmed his status by competing again and winning once more. And seriously, who could have beaten him, given that once, at the top of his shape, he won a race skating backwards while all the other participants used their normal style. But to say Baptie had nothing but skating in his life would be doing him an injustice. He was married and had several children, but that marriage didn't last very long. Although no valid sources say what exactly happened, it's known Baptie parted ways with his wife, supporting his kids from a distance. And that's probably a dark spot in his life, because Lillian, to whom he had been married, didn't like to bring up the topic of Norval Baptie around her children. None of them pursued the skating career either. Starting in 1910, Baptie took an interest in figure skating, or fancy skating as it was called then, and toured his 2 home countries with solo performances. This was an unprecedented thing, because figure skating was considered a niche sport. For someone to take it to a stage and make it an entertainment was unheard of, and yet Baptie was successful in that. As he himself recounted in 1966, a typical performance consisted of 7 acts. At first, Baptie helped dispense the tickets. Then he'd warm up by giving a short speed skating show. The temperatures were low, and he had to keep his limbs warm to do his best during the next stages. After that, he would invite the local young public to a fox chase. Up to 50 skaters were trying hard to catch Baptie on the ice. Needless to say, no one ever succeeded. Then, after a short break, he started barrel jumping. Often, aspiring skaters joined in here as well, competing with the master. They would doggedly go on until Baptie set a plank none of them could reach, and they promised to get better for his next visit to their city. He smiled and went on with his show, this time proceeding with figure skating. And last but not least was a stilt skating performance. Baptie would put on 26-inch high stilts and show some stunts to the oohs and ahs of the public. His stilts were almost twice as high as the regular ones used for such shows. It was in 1914 that Baptie first met his future second spouse, Gladys Lamb. She had been a dancer in Chicago, and Baptie was giving a show in the city. He taught Gladys to skate, and she fell in love both with the sport and with her teacher. In the early 1920s, when Baptie finished his speed skating career, the couple decided to go further and stage numerous ice shows together. At the time, figure skating wasn't as popular as it is today, and skaters performed on rather small, portable ice rinks called tanks. Baptie and Lamb, though, did a lot to bring this beautiful sport to the glory it deserved, and their shows did gather big audiences indeed. In 1924, the couple sealed their relationship with a marriage. By that time, they were well known for their figure skating acts across the United States and Canada. Norval Baptie, in particular, was already a living legend. Going from speed skating to barrel jumps and figure skating, he set new records in whichever ice sports drew his attention. In 1916, he performed a waltz jump over 10 barrels. That's a distance of 20 feet, which was captured in an iconic photograph. For comparison, It was like leaping over an SUV, from bumper to bumper, and wearing the ice skates. During the next 2 decades, Baptie and Gladys Lamb toured the continent with their ice shows, making people marvel at their art, and also acted as coaches for aspiring figure skaters. This was only the dawn of an era, so not many children were into this sport, but Baptie did everything in his power to change things and succeeded. With his wife and lifelong partner, he created the staple acts of what would become regular program in the most notable ice shows of the following decades: Ice Follies, Ice Capade, Holiday on Ice, and many others. When those came to being, he actively participated in their organization too. At some point in the 1930s, he gave his granddaughter a pair of skates and told her to join him in one of his shows when she was ready. Despite disapproval of her mother, Baptie's granddaughter did as he said, discovering a passion for figure skating almost as huge as her grandfather's. Her name was Betty Behrens, and everyone in the sport knew her well. She eventually became an Olympic coach, and there's an award founded in her name that is given to skaters every year. The family talent didn't dry out there either. Baptie's grand and great-grandchildren continued to honor their venerable ancestor by becoming world champions and participants of World Olympics, as well as national and world team members in speed and figure skating. By the way, Baptie revolutionized these sports in a technical way too. He took an active part in redesigning the existing ice skates, making them look more like those we see today. In 1938, Baptie retired from active sports himself and began coaching instead. Many prominent ice skaters of the time learned from him, and hundreds of people wanted to be part of his story. Life wasn't kind to him, however. In the 1940s, he experienced severe complications from a disease he had. But even that didn't break Baptie's will. He continued to coach, even though he was bound to the wheelchair, and a nurse had to always be by his side to take him wherever he needed. In 1963, he proudly observed as his name was registered in Canada's Sports Hall of Fame. It was then, perhaps, that Norval Baptie was finally satisfied with his achievements. 3 years later, at the age of 87, he passed away, serene and bathed in glory. But his legacy, of course, lived on and can be seen even today. Although many haven't even heard his name, Norval Baptie is rightfully called the father of ice shows. The modern performances still rely on the moves and programs he invented and popularized, and even the Olympic program includes some of them. But most importantly, without him, figure skating would probably have taken much more time to progress and become as prominent a sport as it is now. Look into this man's eyes. His whole life is flashing before them right now. His childhood, youth, dreams of the future. He's now at an altitude of 18,000 feet, free-falling to the ground without a parachute. There's no one to help him, and he can only be saved by an incredible miracle. And then, it happened. Joseph B. Herman is a 21-year-old flight lieutenant pilot for the Royal Australian Air Force. It's Saturday, November 4th, 1944. His Handley Page Halifax is about to take off from Driffield, England. Tonight, they're flying to the coal mines near Bochum, Germany. So our hero takes the helm and joins the raid with 749 aircraft. Little does Herman's squadron know, the defenders are ready for their arrival. Within moments, the unit finds themselves surrounded by anti-aircraft cannons below. These things can reach targets flying at 39,000 feet. The planes on this mission are flying half that high. It's a recipe for disaster. That's when the night sky gets set on fire, with planes going down right and left. Herman must keep his cool. He has to show his best skills to keep himself and his crew of 6 out of harm's way. They end up completing the mission. But just 5 minutes later, boom, Herman's plane is hit in the rear spar. The aircraft catches fire, and the pilot must take quick, decisive action to save everyone on board. His thoughts are racing, but not fast enough. 2 more shells hit the plane's wings. The fire engulfs the aircraft. Herman immediately orders all the crew members to jump out of the plane. But he knows he can't abandon the ship. He'd taken his chute off a bit earlier because it was uncomfortable. The lieutenant has to get to the engineering compartment where his parachute is if he's going to make it out of this thing. But as soon as he leaves his seat, the aircraft's right wing tears off. Within milliseconds, the plane rolls and then explodes. Its burning parts approach the Earth like a meteor shower. What's left of the Halifax falls outside the small town of Neviges, damaging someone's cottage so badly that the owners eventually had to demolish it. But what happened to Joseph Herman? Rewind back to when the plane blew apart. The force threw the pilot, still without a parachute, out of the aircraft. He's now in free fall among the wreckage 18,000 feet up. The next 90 seconds will decide his fate. It's dark, but our hero initially tries to search for a parachute among the falling debris. The search isn't successful. Panic sets in. Herman shouts and waves his arms, but then the Australian pilot realizes he's doomed. Best not to waste the last of his energy and time. He relaxes and tries to find the safest place to land below. A minute passes. He's fallen 12,000 feet, 30 seconds left until impact. As soon as Herman reaches an altitude of 6,000 feet, what happened next can only be described as a miracle, or at least incredibly good luck. His body crashes into something. This something is different from the lifeless wreckage of the plane. The lieutenant realizes they're a person's legs. He hears a familiar voice. "Hello, is someone there?" It's the Halifax's mid-top gunner, John Vivish. "Just me, Joe," the pilot replies. The odds are astounding, but I'll get into that a bit later. For now, the men aren't out of the woods yet. That parachute wasn't made to be used by two people at the same time. With the added weight of an unexpected passenger, the two fall faster than what's safe. They approach the ground and get ready for impact. It's still a hard fall. Vivash lands on Herman's chest and injures a couple of his ribs. But they don't have time to rest or inspect the damage. They're still behind enemy lines. Their dangerous adventure has only just begun. First, they quickly bury their parachute to cover their tracks. They need to leave this crash site now to avoid being captured. The airmen are able to hide from patrols and remain undetected from the night of November 4th until the morning of November 9th. They move only at night. During the day, they hide in the woods and random barns. They're hungry, hurting, and exhausted. These two poor fellows reach the village of Wolfrath. Their injuries are making themselves known. Our heroes must take a risk if they're going to survive. They ask for help at a local farm. Hey! They're immediately handed over to the authorities and locked up. Herman and Vivash are questioned for a long time. None of the German officers can believe their incredible story of being saved by a single parachute. In the end, they had to show the place where they buried it, and only then could they prove the truth of their impossible story. But this didn't get them out of trouble, and they remained in custody. The two spent 11 days in the hospital. Then they were separated and sent to two different places for captured airmen. Lieutenant Herman was transferred from place to place 3 times until he was released from captivity on April 22, 1945. Well, finally we can breathe a sigh of relief. This story has a good ending. But all this is the result of an unbelievable combination of circumstances. So much could have gone wrong. For example, Lieutenant Herman could have been injured at the very moment his plane was hit. You see, those anti-aircraft projectiles throw dangerous shrapnel when they explode, which could have immediately made this story a lot shorter than what it ended up being. He also wasn't knocked unconscious. If he had been out cold, he would have just bumped into Vivish's legs and kept falling, instead of grabbing onto them in an instant. And then there was this intense freefall. They were falling exactly in line with each other, yet they bailed from the plane at different times. At that moment, Vivish had happened to be in a horizontal position, allowing Herman to grab onto his legs. And Vivish had just opened his parachute the same moment Herman grabbed onto him. Any earlier, and they wouldn't have met, or if they did, they would have collided with a huge force and probably bounced off each other like billiard balls. If Vivish had opened his chute after the already unlikely meeting, Herman wouldn't have been able to keep his grip. This number of coincidences would make anyone doubt the legitimacy of this story. Well, in February and March 2014, a group of volunteers and German archaeologists did excavations at the supposed crash site. They found about 40 parts and fragments that undoubtedly belonged to Joseph B. Herman's plane. So, 70 years later, the story turned out to be undeniably true. After the end of all the events of 1945, Lieutenant Joseph B. Herman of the RAAF lived a quiet, simple life. He became a crop duster pilot with an incredible story to tell. See the barrel? About 4.5 feet tall? There's nothing unusual about it, except for the fact that it's bobbing and dunking just above the churning chaos of Niagara Falls. Another moment or two, and the barrel's hurtling over the edge and toward the bottom of the waterfall more than 170 feet down. What you can't see is that there's a person inside the barrel. Annie Edson Taylor was born into a family with 8 kids. Her father was a flour mill owner. He passed away when the girl was 12, but he left enough money for his family to have a comfortable living. So, when Annie decided to build a school teacher career, there was nothing to prevent her from doing it. She even earned an honors degree after finishing a 4-year-long training course. While studying, she met her future husband. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last long. Sadly, Annie became a widow. The woman spent decades of her life in all kinds of teaching jobs and moving between different places. Years later, she ended up in Bay City, Michigan. She wanted to become a dancing instructor, but there wasn't any dancing schools in the city. No problem, Taylor opened up one of her own. In 1900, she moved to the city of Sault Ste. Marie to teach music. Later, she traveled to San Antonio, Texas, and even visited Mexico City in search of work. When this attempt failed, she returned to Bay City. But all this traveling, though exciting, left her with almost no money and very few belongings. She needed to work out a way to bolster her bank account for when she wouldn't be able to work anymore. One day, she was reading a newspaper article about the daredevils who had been riding out the dangerous rapids at the bottom of Niagara Falls. An idea occurred to her. She thought, why don't I do better and actually plunge over the waterfall? If I survive, I'll become famous. In truth, Annie had no doubt she would get out of this adventure alive. She was an exceptionally determined and upbeat woman. That's why she immediately got down to work, putting her plan into action. Annie wasn't naive enough to believe she would manage to survive the fall without some kind of protection. That's why Annie chose to use a custom-made pickle barrel. She designed the vessel herself. First, she sketched a diagram and made a prototype out of cardboard. Then she hand-picked each piece of wood that had to be used for the barrel. A local company that produced beverage kegs used this wood to construct the barrel. It was an uneven, 5-foot-tall and 3-foot-wide container made of white oak and weighing about 160 pounds. It was secured by 10 wide metal hoops. Inside the cask, there was a leather harness to prevent Annie from bouncing around and a mattress to cushion the fall. A massive 200-pound metal block was placed at the bottom of the barrel. It had to serve as ballast, keeping the barrel in the upright position. Soon, everything was ready for the show. Annie decided to perform it on her 63rd birthday, on October 24, 1901. Curiously, the woman told the reporter she was in her 40s. People who were supposed to help Taylor with her plunge were skeptical. Even on the day when it had to take place, the event was put off several times. The assistants were afraid that if something went wrong, they would be to blame. But finally, at about 4 p.m., the barrel was loaded onto a rowboat and Annie climbed inside. She was holding her lucky heart-shaped pillow. The assistants screwed down the lid and pumped in some fresh air. There had to be enough for her to breathe for 1 hour, but the entire trick was supposed to take much less time, about 20 minutes. Finally, the hole used for venting the air was corked, and the brave woman floated away on her risky business. Several thousand onlookers were eyeing the process. The container with Annie inside was towed from the Niagara River's deeper Canadian side toward the Horseshoe Falls. It's the largest of the 2 cascades that form Niagara Falls. Near Goat Island, the barrel was set adrift and floated toward the mighty cataract. Was Annie nervous? Yeah, that would be a great understatement. Her heart was beating wildly in her chest. Her breathing was fast, too fast. Her hands and feet were cold and her palms sweaty. It felt as if there wasn't enough air inside the wooden container, but the woman was determined to be brave. Suddenly, the barrel accelerated, caught in the current, and dashed toward the edge of the waterfall. People watching from the shore couldn't see it anymore. The thing was lost in the mist surrounding the whirling water. Inside her fragile shelter, Annie was listening to the roar of the falls. It was growing louder and louder. A moment of bizarre calm at the very edge, and the barrel plunged from the height greater than the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The fall was shorter than Annie had expected. Mere seconds later, her vessel hit the surface and went underwater. The barrel was spinning wildly and tossed around like a twig. A moment later, it resurfaced. The vessel was intact, but water had already started to seep in. After drifting downstream for a while, the barrel came to a stop at a rock in the river. Immediately, Annie's assistants were next to it. A bunch of anxious men tore the lid off. Annie, seasick, bruised, and clutching her soaked pillow, was looking back at them. One of the rescuers was so shocked to see her alive that he grabbed a megaphone and shouted this news to the spectators. The Maid of the Mist, a tour boat lingering nearby, blew her horn to celebrate Annie's success. Annie said later that she had lost consciousness only once, right after the fall. The rest of the time, she was alert and feeling everything that was happening to the barrel. Annie found the fame she had been seeking. She was nicknamed the Goddess of Water and got celebrity status almost instantly after her adventure. People even wrote poems about her. Sadly, she didn't manage to earn as much money as she had hoped, and her fame was fleeting. Annie wrote memoirs, and she was going to sell the book near Niagara Falls. But her manager disappeared, having stolen her barrel. Annie spent almost all her savings on private detectives trying to get the thing back. She had been planning to use it as a prop while giving public speeches. Sometime later, the barrel was spotted in Chicago. But before Annie could get her hands on it, the barrel vanished again, this time for good. The only thing Annie could do was to pose for photographs at her souvenir stand. She also tried to write a novel and reconstruct her fall on film, but no movie was ever shown. In 1906, the woman even mentioned she could take a second plunge into the waterfall, but it never happened. Several years after Annie's stunt, both the Canadian and New York authorities introduced special laws. They were supposed to prevent risk-takers from following in the schoolteacher's daring footsteps. It didn't stop people from trying and facing huge fines. Well, dare I say it? It was more fun than a barrel of monkeys.
Meet Arthur John Priest. No, he isn't famous for being a painter or for discovering some long-lost treasure. He didn't invent some cool gadget or break any world records. No, Arthur John Priest is famous simply for being unsinkable. Proving one can be both lucky and unlucky at the same time, Priest was involved in and survived several mishaps at sea, including the fateful maiden voyage of the Titanic. Priest was not a rich man interested in sailing for pleasure. He was part of the working class, employed as a stoker or fireman, stuck for hours within the hot bowels of large steam-powered vessels. His job was dirty and difficult. He was responsible for keeping the furnaces lit, feeding them coal to ensure enough steam was produced for the engines to work. He had to be careful about not overheating the system or setting fire to the whole ship. The furnaces had to be carefully watched and constantly fed. He breathed it all in a while, working and fighting with the sweat and the dirt. He would often work shirtless because of the heat and was always covered in black coal dust. And when he finally had a break, his shared living quarters were nearby in the same part of the ship. He must have been good at his job, though, because he had no trouble finding work. But wherever he went, bad luck seemed to follow. The first incident was a mild one. As a young man, Priest worked on the RMS Asturias. The passenger liner first set sail in 1907, traveling between Southampton in the UK to Buenos Aires in Argentina. At some point during its maiden voyage, the ship suffered a small collision. the damage was bad enough that the ship returned for repairs. Thankfully, there were no reports of any serious injuries. Priest, unfazed, simply went to work on another ship, but his bad luck lingered on the Asturias. In 1914, the Asturias became a hospital ship, helping care for sick men and women around Europe while bringing them home to England. But in March 1917, at just around midnight, the ship was struck by a foreign object. Its hull was breached and the engine room flooded. The captain ordered everyone to abandon the ship, sending crew, patients, and health staff scrambling for the lifeboats. The vessel was still moving, powering through the water because the main controls, located within the flooded engine room, could not be turned off. The captain refused to leave the ship while people were still trying to escape. He was able to aim the Asturias towards Bolt Head, where it finally hit land and couldn't sink. The remaining lifeboats were lowered and the final survivors made it to safety. When they studied the damage on the ship later, the Asturias was declared a total write-off. It might be hard to pin this particular disaster on Priest. After all, he wasn't even on the ship at the time. But it seemed that many of the ships on which he served were destined for trouble. His bad luck followed him to his next job on the RMS Olympic, a massive ocean liner. The Olympic was big. In fact, it had been designed and built as part of the fleet that included the Titanic. But with size came sacrifice. The Olympic was great at moving in one direction, but very difficult to handle when it needed to turn. It was September 1911. The Olympic was trying to alter its course. The Hawk, a smaller ship sailing nearby, didn't give the larger vessel enough room to maneuver, and the two slammed into each other. Because the Hawk was engineered to deal with potential confrontations when out at sea, its reinforced bow tore through the Olympic. Two large gashes appeared on the ocean liner's side. The propeller shaft was badly twisted, and worse, the ship began to take on water. Somehow, the Olympic made it to shore without sinking, and nobody was seriously hurt. Priest had no idea that this was just a small taste of what his future held for him. He next found employment on a brand new ship, a better ship, an unsinkable marvel that was said to be the biggest vessel to have ever been built. Yes, he was going to work on the Titanic. And what a job! It took 29 boilers, requiring 850 tons of coal a day to produce enough steam to power the Titanic. Priest was just one of 150 stokers toiling away in the ship's underbelly, keeping those fires burning day and night. He made around $30 a month. But on April 14, 1912, he would find himself flung from a world of extreme heat to one of blistering cold. At approximately 11:35 p.m., the crew spotted an iceberg. The Titanic tried to avoid it, but the alarm had been sounded too late. 5 minutes later, the two collided. The iceberg tore through the hull, and the once watertight compartments inside were badly ruptured. As the cold Atlantic water flooded in, the ship began to sink. Distress signals were sent, but the closest ship, the Carpathia, was over 3 hours away. In the dark of night and stuck in the middle of nowhere, the crew and passengers panicked. Those who could scrambled for the lifeboats. Others jumped into the icy waters. In total, only 706 survived that terrible night. Priest, at the time of the collision, was down in the ship's lower quarters. He was on break, relaxing from a hard day of work. And as the ship went down, so did his chances of survival. He and his fellow workers were in the most dangerous position on the ship. They had to make their way through a maze of corridors and gangways, some of which were flooded, in a mad dash to the deck. And then they faced the frigid water, jumping in and desperately swimming to safety. The ocean was so cold that Priest even suffered frostbite before finding his way onto a lifeboat. He was one of only 44 stokers to survive that night. After an experience like that, most of us would never set foot on a boat again. But Priest had to work. His next job also ended in disaster. He was offered employment on the HMS Alcantara. It went down in 1916, and Priest was again one of the few to make it to safety. He was badly wounded in the process. But he kept pressing his luck, and his next job as a stoker may have felt eerily familiar. He would be working on a ship built by the same people behind both the Olympic and the Titanic. And this ship, named the Britannic, was the biggest of the three. It was also believed to be a superior vessel, fitted with new safety features after the Titanic sank. For example, it had 48 open lifeboats, 46 of which were the largest ever used on a ship before. 2 of these were even motorized and equipped with special communication devices. The good news? The Britannic survived its first trip without incident. It was already doing better than the Titanic ever did. However, on November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was shaken by a loud explosion while traveling through the key channel in the Aegean Sea. The hull was damaged, and some of the compartments began to fill with water. But, unlike the Titanic, the Britannic had been designed for just such an emergency. It had been fitted with 5 watertight bulkheads. Intact, these would help keep the ship safe and floating for a much longer period of time. But there was one issue. Portholes along the lower decks had foolishly been left open. As the ship tilted, the portholes let in water, which flooded the Britannic and hastened its descent into the sea. This effectively made those watertight bulkheads useless. The ship was going down fast, much faster, in fact, than the Titanic had sunk. 35 of the lifeboats were successfully launched, saving most on board. Of the 1,066 passengers and crew, 1,036 survived. Priest, his luck intact, was one of them. And yet, he still wasn't done with a life at sea. He accepted a position as a stoker on the Donegal. It was a smaller passenger ferry that had been converted for use as a hospital boat. In April 1917, it was struck by a foreign object while fleeing an unsafe situation, and though he suffered from a head injury, Priest was again one of the survivors. It took experiencing 2 collisions and 4 sinkings before Priest was finally ready to retire. In fact, he reportedly said he only gave it up because no one wanted to sail with him. Can you blame them? He would live out the rest of his life on dry land in Southampton, England, with his wife Annie and their 3 sons. But Arthur John Priest would always be remembered as the unsinkable stoker.